Hello, and welcome to this brief lecture on the election of 1912. The election of 1912 is one of those United States presidential elections that really does change the course of American history. You can imagine a very different scenario over the next 4 years, and particularly with regards to World War I, depending upon whether or not a different candidate emerges. It's an interesting four-way race between a bunch of very different people. The first one I'll talk about is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was then the Democratic governor of the state of New Jersey. He was born in 1856 in Virginia and the son of a Presbyterian minister. He spent almost his entire life in the South, and he grew up during both the Civil War and Reconstruction and was deeply influenced by both events. Eventually, Wilson pursued higher education in North Carolina before transferring to what was then the College of New Jersey. Today we call it Princeton, and graduated in 1879. He briefly attended the University of Virginia Law School, but attended due to health issues and had to leave. He studied for the bar independently and was admitted in 1882 before practicing law in Atlanta. But really, we know him as an academic. Woodrow Wilson is our most academic president in history. In 1883, he earned a PhD in both history and political science. And he wrote a doctoral work that led to the publication of a work called Congressional Government, which was a very critical analysis of the American political system. He had a variety of different teaching positions and then eventually went back to teach at his alma mater, then called Princeton University. He was then later elected governor of New Jersey in 1910. That was his first political post. So he ran for president 2 years later, really only having 2 years of political experience. He was very interested in progressive reforms, and that enhanced his reputation, and he became the Democratic candidate for president in 1912. Now, the incumbent was William Howard Taft. He was the 27th president of the United States, and he had served already from 1909 to the present year, 1912. His presidency was very much a mixture of progressive policies and conservative policies, and he struggled politically because of major conflicts within the Republican Party, particularly, as we'll talk about, with his predecessor and his former ally, Theodore Roosevelt. During his presidency, there were a couple of notable things that happened. We passed what was called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909. It was intended to lower tariffs, which had been extremely high under President McKinley, got a little bit lower under Roosevelt. And ultimately, it didn't work. And the fact that it didn't work angered progressive Republicans who saw it as a betrayal of their economic reform goals. He was very aggressive when it came to breaking up trusts and monopolies, filing more than 90 lawsuits, and actually surpassing the guy known as the trust buster, Teddy Roosevelt. His administration notably broke up Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act and American Tobacco Company for anti-competitive practices. They also passed what was called the Bollinger-Pinochet Affair. This is a controversy that erupts between Richard Bollinger, who's Taft's Secretary of the Interior, and Gifford Pinochet, the head of the Forestry Service. Essentially, what's going on here is you have two administrators in Taft's administration accusing each other of corruption. Taft sided with Bollinger and fired Pinochet, which alienated Roosevelt and the progressives even more. So many of these specific facts aren't important, but what you have to remember is that during Taft's presidency, you're seeing a rift form in the Republican Party between the progressives on one hand and the conservatives on another. And that rift is going to prove fatal in the election of 1912. But Taft also established the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to support business interests. He created it as an organization that could advocate for business-friendly purposes. He pursued what he called dollar diplomacy, which encouraged U.S. investment in Latin America and Asia to expand both American influence and economic interests. He admitted New Mexico and Arizona as states in 1912. But then that same year, He split with Teddy Roosevelt, and Roosevelt, disappointed in Taft's policies, will run against him for the Republican nomination in 1912. So that then brings us to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the former Republican president. He had served up to 1909 and had actually handpicked William Howard Taft to serve as his successor. When he was unable to get the Republican nomination, he tried to secure it to run against Taft and was blocked. He actually formed his own party. This was called the Progressive Party, but was generally known as the Bull Moose Party. And the Bull Moose Party was intended to try to drive towards progressive Republican policies, things like lowering tariffs, taking on big business, and so on and so forth. Roosevelt was determined to push through progressive reforms, including women's suffrage, direct election of senators, social welfare programs, and stricter regulation of corporations. He firmly believed that by the time he was rejected as the nominee in 1912, that the Republican Party had effectively abandoned these critical causes. So the reason, by the way, that it's referred to as the Bull Moose Party is because at one said, I suppose it was a campaign rally, Roosevelt declared, quote, "I feel as strong as a bull moose," when asked about his health. So that's where the name comes from if you're interested. The platform and goals of the Bull Moose Party included women's suffrage, social insurance programs, 8-hour workdays and worker rights, the direct election of senators, which was actually later achieved by the 17th Amendment, more democracy in governments, including initiatives, referendums, and recalls, and, overall, an effort to make progressive things happen. Now, I should point out that during the campaign, there was an assassination attempt on Teddy Roosevelt. He was actually shot in the chest in the middle of a speech in Milwaukee. Remarkably, he still continued the speech, speaking for another 90 minutes before seeking medical attention. And again, he incorporated the bull moose, saying, quote, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." But there were four candidates in this election, and the fourth was Eugene V. Debs. He was the Socialist Party nominee and a labor leader. He, like Wilson, was born a long time ago in 1855. He left school at the age of 14 to work in railroad shops and became a fireman on the railroad, actually, someone who's responsible for putting out fires that actually were fairly common at the time. He joined the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen in 1875 and quickly rose through the ranks. Throughout his entire life, Eugene V. Debs would be an advocate for labor and for the sorts of practices that could make the average working conditions better for the average blue collar American. He was elected as a Democrat to the Indiana state legislature in 1885, but quickly became disillusioned with both major parties, Republican and Democrat. He founded one of the first industrial unions in the United States, the American Railway Union. But really, where you see his life change is during what's called the Pullman Strike in 1894. The Pullman Strike erupted when the Pullman Company, which was in charge of different types of railway workers, cut wages, but kept housing rents high in what were called company owned towns. These were very prevalent back then. Essentially, if you had a company town, the company, let's say Amazon now by way of an analogy, owned actually all the housing. They owned the stores, they owned everything in the town. Oftentimes, within these different company towns, people were paid with company dollars. And so you weren't paid in US currency, you were paid with company dollars, which you could redeem in the company store. This wasn't the case with the Pullman crisis, but it was the case in many places. But what they essentially did was they cut the wages of their workers, but they didn't reduce the rents within their company towns. So you kind of lost it on two sides. As a result, the union led a massive nationwide strike, which crippled railroad traffic. The federal government at the time, under Grover Cleveland, sent troops to break the strike, leading to violence and multiple deaths. For his involvement in the strike, Debs was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison. While in prison, Debs read Karl Marx and other socialists, and upon release, he abandoned the Democratic Party, became a socialist, and began to found the Socialist Party of America. advocating for government ownership of industries, worker rights, and democratic socialism. He actually ran for president a number of times. He ran in 1900, winning 0.6% of the popular vote. He ran in 1904 and actually got all the way up to 3% of the popular vote. Ran again in 1908, saw a slight decrease down to 2.8%. But by 1912, Debs had become a national figure, known for his fiery speeches against capitalism and corporate power. So, what happens then in the election of 1900? So, as often happens in this sort of situation, what happens is the four people essentially split the vote. And the reason that this is important is because, as you can see, the blue is Democrat. And so Woodrow Wilson is going to win a resounding 435 out of 531 electoral votes. But Wilson actually only won 41.8% of the popular vote. So he didn't even come remotely close to 50%. Roosevelt, running as a third party candidate, he's the one there in yellow. He achieved 27% of the popular vote and won 88 electoral votes, making him one of, if not the most successful third party candidate in US history. Taft was actually not far behind him. He won 23.2% of the popular vote, but got only 8 electoral votes. Debs, by the way, got 6%. So he doubled, his best showing up to that date. However, if you look at the math here, and if you add up Roosevelt's 27% and Taft's 23%, you realize that if the two sides had been able to come together and run as a united party, they would have easily overwhelmed Woodrow Wilson's 41%. The election of 1912 is often regarded as the high watermark of the progressive era in American politics. As you can see, every one of these candidates, really except for Taft, was pushing progressive reforms. And Wilson's victory is going to lead to significant economic reforms, including changes to tariffs and banking policies. The election remains a significant example of how internal party divisions can reshape political landscapes and influence electoral outcomes. And I think it's another great example of this quirk of the American system that we call the Electoral College. Because if you look at the overall popular vote, it's very different from what someone achieved in the Electoral College here, but worth noting all the same. In the end, the election of 1912, as we'll find out, marks a critical turning point in American history.